What's up, y'all? I have a behemoth of a video for you today. I'm going to be showing 9 different hyperpop bass sounds, all using Vital and a little bit of resampling. They're pretty vastly different, each of the different bass sounds, so like this should give you an idea of what all sound design you can use when you're making basses, specifically for hyperpop. And then I'll use the timestamps on this one so you can kind of skip through and see which sounds you want to make and which sounds you don't. And I'll start each section out with a little demo of what the sound sounds like. Then lastly for this one, you know, a lot of the work that went into making this video was pretty much like trying to get it to sound as close as I could to the original song. But I wouldn't really worry too much if that, you know, about that if I was you. I would focus more on like picking up the tips and the tricks and stuff that you learned from this video, and not trying to get the exact same bass that I have here, because some of these are just complicated to the point where you're not going to get the exact same thing, but you can still make your own cool version of it. And if you do want to get the exact basses from this, I'll put a project file with all of these basses and some samples rendered out from it and some other stuff on my Patreon. So go to my Patreon if you want to skip the work and just get the goodies. And with that, let's go ahead and jump into the first bass here, which is blackwinterwells, A Letter.
You feel strange, and everything is distant. I can't sing without hearing your voice in the background. We were the same.
So this is what the bass sounds like by itself. And it starts out as a saw wave with envelope 1 having 50% sustain in the default settings for these two parameters, decay and release. Then we set up our second envelope because it's going to be plucking the resonance and the frequency of an analog 12 filter with a 0 sustain and then a little bit shorter of a decay, and that's going to give us kind of our plucky synth bass type sound. Then the next thing that you need to know is your voices here need to be set to 1, and then legato mode needs to be on. And the reason for that is that's monophonic, which means you can't play chords. And then it bends between the notes. So we're going to give it a little bit of glide and turn legato on. So what legato does is says if legato is turned on every time a new note gets played, you don't re-trigger your filters here. So this is with legato on, and I'm going to play a quick run of notes. And this is with legato off. Right, so it just keeps you from having that synth pluck happen every time, and we don't want that because, you know, with the original, which isn't that important, but with the legato turned on, we get that type of a pluck sound instead of that type of a pluck sound. So we want that for this particular exact sound. Next thing that we have is a phaser, and the point of this is to kind of give it that like acid funky bass type sound. So I'll turn the mix all the way up on this. Just know that envelope 1 here is modulating the mix, so it kind of brings the mix in when we play each note and then kind of turns it off as the note plays. But the point of this is we have the offset set to 0, and that makes it mono, so we're not getting any stereo introduced. And then we have a really low frequency here, right? We don't want it wiggling around. We want a relatively like slow moving band. And then I'm just, you know, plucking this center piece, right? The center parameter. And that gives us that like funky acid type sound. Then moving into post effects here, we have the first one is a wave shaper. Chunks it up, gets that funky acid type sound, and you can get this by just taking, you know, this shape here, like setting this shape up, and then clicking this, and just notice that like anytime there's a wave shaper in this tutorial, you're going to want to look at the pre-mix and post positions because I've changed them from some of the presets, and also this is really what makes this these, of course, like any plugin, these are what, you know, affect how this works. So then for the post effects, we have first of all a wave shaper, which is just doing a tan distortion shape, and you can get that by kind of drawing this upward parabola type curve, and then clicking this bipolar mode here. Then just anytime I have a wave shaper in this tutorial, which there's going to be a good amount of wave shaper, it's a pretty versatile distortion. Just note the pre-mix and post locations. That's kind of the most important thing here, is the shape of this and where are these 3 dials sitting. That gives it the more distorted funk bass sound. Then the next thing in the chain is a warming OTT is what I'll call this. And I'll kind of do this with a fresh OTT here so you can get an idea of how to set one of these up. What I wanted was something that brings the mids up and then doesn't distort and like blow the, doesn't compress the low end super hard, but brings it up to kind of be comparable with the mids. And then lastly, I don't want this like high end, super heavy upwards compression that brings in that like squeaky, squelchy high. So you can turn that off by doing that. And then I just kind of brought this down and then lowered the depth. So as you can see there, that just gives me like a much better, cleaner OTT sound out of it, or more, just kind of using the OTT instead of just putting OTT and being like, yep, make it super loud. This is a pretty versatile plugin compared to what people tend to use it for. And then also, using the high time values tend to give you a smoother sound, while shorter ones get you like a brighter, more energetic sound. So shorter, brighter, longer, smoother. Then these last two post effects are really more for mixing than anything else. I have a low pass with a little another boost for the mid ranges. I just want a fat mid range on this synth, and then a compressor with like a pretty slow time. And so the EQ here is just to help it kind of be nice and fat, right? And not fight with that vocal so much. And then this compressor is to just make it to where when the plucks happen, it kind of lowers the gain of those. As you can see, it's compressing my peaks right there and then kind of flattening out where the sustain is at. So kind of just bringing the dynamic range on that down a little bit. Then lastly, I have a fruity send that I've used on this, and I'm only going to talk about the send on this one, and just know from here forward, if there's ever a fruity send at the end of one of these chains, it is to act as a side chain to the kick, except in this occasion where it is
I can't sing.
Just cutting out the bass for that little section of the track where it happens in the original there. So moving on to our next one, we have the warm kind of distorted respace from Two Hollis' song Teenage Soldier.
I heard your voice last night. You didn't have to call back.
And I'm going to skip to where it changes later with just a couple of automations. And this one's quite a bit simpler. We basically just have a saw wave with 9 voices of unison and 32% unison detune, and then 4.350 on the unison detune power. So just a warbly saw that we're sending into some repeating effects, so some iterating like EQs and distortions. So the first thing that we have here is a Pro Q3 low pass with a little bump on the mids again, kind of warming it up some. Then next we're sending it into a wave shaper, which is using the Fast Distortion 2 preset. I don't even think I changed any of these knobs, so just Fast Distortion 2. And just notice how like this signal chain with the wave shaper first misses out like on some of the crunchiness of the highs that you get by boosting the mids before versus after. So like the order that you add these EQs and wave shapers and distortions definitely matters a lot. So then we have a wave folder, and I think this is something that I think from doing a couple of Two Hollis sounds, I do think that there's a lot of wave folding going on in Two Hollis' tracks, or that's the closest that I could get to it. And what I'm doing here is basically taking a super heavy wave folding that I've added here and then just bringing the dry wet down. M Wave Folder's free, so definitely go get the Melda free bundle. It's worth it because they're all just super useful and pretty decent sounding plugins. And just note that I have a ton of drive here, right? And then just way less dry wet. So I'll kind of move on from this. Then the last thing that we have here is a steeper low pass with another bump for the low mids, right? So that gets us our first half of the sound. Then for the second half, we have 3 things that are being automated in. So I'll kind of bring all 3 of these things that are being automated up at the same time. I'll just kind of show what's happening over time. So I'm fading both of these low passes up and then just turning this effect on using the mix knob that's right here. All right, so we'll speed through this. And that gets us a lot closer to the what's actually being used in like the heavier parts of this song. So nice simple one there. If there's one thing that I would say to like get an even closer sound is like definitely make a second noise layer and like experiment with like reverb and noise and like phasing and weird stuff that I think really like makes this closer to the original, because a lot of the distortion I think on this main thing is actually coming from other elements of the track that are also getting heavily distorted. So moving on from there to probably the most complicated and frustrating of the remake sounds that I had in this particular batch, and that is Rewind by Charlie XCX. I think this was produced by AC Slater, but don't quote me on that. So without the sidechain and other elements, it sounds like this. And we're going to start this one out with the sub, and I'm going to be spending a little less time on these that have multiple oscillators because it's just not that beneficial. I'll just kind of say what the purpose of each different set of oscillators is without being like, make sure you set your thing to here and here and here, because it'll just bloat the size of this video way too high. So for this one, we have envelope 1 doing a little bit of an attack, 50% sustain, pretty short decay. I'll turn off these filters and the effects that I have here, and kind of bring these in one at a time. So first we have our sub, which is a basic square wave. And then we are sending that into an analog 12 filter where I've used envelope 2, which is not shorter of an envelope, but shorter, but a lower sustain for sure. And if you don't have headphones or speakers, you're probably not gonna be able to hear that, but that's just adding that sub note there and kind of plucking it. Key tracking is turned on for this, so it follows the when key tracking is turned up, it means that the frequency of this moves in proportion to where the note is played. So lower notes, higher notes, you know, it goes up for the higher notes, whereas reversing this is the opposite. It goes the opposite direction. So giving us our sub there, then we have, and I'll turn this off for a second, we have a pulse width square and a low-high fold that are going into filter 2 here. And again, just plucking the bottom. And the idea for this is I wanted just a crunchy, like synthetic, clubby feeling, crunchy mid-range to kind of pluck with that. So then we introduce our sub back in. And then for this one, again, I added a little bit of glide and I turned always glide on to make it just kind of bounce in between the notes. That's too much glide. That's a better amount of glide right there. So moving on to the filter, we have a band peak notch where I'm specifically using the peak function, which is in the middle right here, 50%. And I'm just kind of plucking the low mids. Then I'm sending this into some post effects, which start with a saturator, heavy pushing up on the input and then bringing down the output. So we're kind of getting that like clubby square low bass type feel out of that now. Boosting the low mids, cutting the, you know, low passing the highs out. And now you'll kind of hear the glide more. That's a little too much. That's probably... You can kind of feel the glide more once it gets louder. So then moving into the more hellishly complicated part of this one, and that is the high brass synth layer thing. And this one, without post effects, sounds like this. And it's made up of 3 different layers. So I'll start with the simplest one, and that is just a noise that I'm kind of playing hits on that I've set up an envelope for. Right, so that envelope just gates the volume, and then we're sending it into a Valhalla room. to give it a little bit of space. And again, this is with full mix. So it's not one of these long tail reverbs, it's a really short room reverb. Then we're adding this EQ that has a high boost that is dynamically compressing down to give more of a transient to that high part. So that versus this. And it's also getting rid of a lot of the low mud from this high pass here, this low cut. So then the next layer that we have is a real a horn sample that I took out of a sound font player. So I wanted to get a sample that I could use in FL Studio's sampler. And I've just added this volume envelope again. So a short little hit, and then I've added a couple of effects here. So first I have a pitch shifter that's shifting it up 24 semitones with the mix at about 30%. So kind of just doubling that horn. Then we have an OTT compressing it together. Then we have phase distortion, giving it some dirtiness. If you don't have phase distortion, just use regular distortion for that. And then we have an EQ on this. And those two pieces, those two layers are being bussed into the same mixer track as this first piece here. So we'll kind of turn those off for a second. And so without any post effects, this is what the synth sound that both of those are being bussed into. This is the original sound that I started with before I added those two layers. So building this one up from scratch, we start with a pulse width oscillator. Envelope 1 has a short little attack, relatively short decay, around 50% sustain, and then a little bit longer than default of release here. 9 voices a unison, and I'm using envelope 2, which is a little bit longer of an attack and way longer of a decay, to modulate the wavetable position here. 9 voices a unison. I don't know if I said that already, but I'll just kind of keep moving. Then I have this horn sample that I've had to set to 22 semitones because it was originally in D. I want it to be at the root pitch, so 22 is up an octave to where, you know, these low notes that I'm playing right here are at the original pitch of what my, basically I'm just matching this pitch right here to this oscillator's pitch. So then we have 2 more oscillators that are bringing in the same type sound. So this one right here, which is 10 voices a unison, but it's pitched up an octave and 7 semitones, which is a perfect fifth, I'm pretty sure. And then the 3 Graces, which has 12 unison voices, is kind of the same basic like interval as this right here. Next, we're sending this into a band spread flange filter where I'm modulating a couple things in here, which is the cutoff and the resonance. And I have it set to the middle position here with key tracking turned on. All of my 4 sounds are going into that, which is then going into this second filter. So the signal flow goes all 4 of these into here. This is then routed into here, where I just have a digital 12 band filter here, which is the middle position on this little knob right here. And I am again using, I'm actually using envelope 1 to modulate this, and envelope 2, I don't know if I mentioned, to modulate these two. So then I send it into a fully wet reverb with a really short time that's also being modulated by envelope 1. Anything else modulated in here? No, just the time is being modulated with a relatively low size and then a little dampening on the high and even more dampening on the lows. Then I send that into a single band compressor. Really long, really short attack on that, and then another flange filter, so a low high flange plus, where I'm using a mix, a mix modulation that's using envelope 1. So when I said at the beginning of this one, or I hope I don't edit this part out, but basically there's one thing to this particular sound that I think is important, and that is using it. So then the next thing that we have here is the post effects, and this is with, so when I said at the beginning of this one, or I hope I don't edit this part out, but basically there's one thing to this particular sound that I think is important, and that is using a flange filter or another flange, or I have a reverb filter later in the processing chain. You're gonna have to finick with the cutoff and the position and the key tracking and stuff. You're gonna have to finick with that to get this type of sound out of it. And the most important thing for this particular sound is going to be to like have your flanges, reverbs, comb filters, whatever you're using to get that weird, like, you know, flowy metallic sound out of it. You're going to have to finick with that. That's going to be something that I would say put some focus into this particular section of the, you know, making of this sound. So then the next thing that we have here is the post effects, and this is with post effects, without post effects. So let's kind of break these down one at a time. First, we have distortion. Then we have the serum effects, which is a reverb filter, relatively low wetness on this. The dampenings here, just kind of look at these settings. Just note that the pan is at 30%, cutoff's relatively low, resonance relatively high. Then the next thing that we have here is an EQ. I'm boosting the highs, boosting the mids. I'm not going to really spend too much time on that because it's just dependent on what you get from the starting point. Then we have a limiter, and I think at this point it'd be probably pertinent to introduce my two other sounds back into this. So this is what these layers are adding to this at this point here. So this is the horn. So getting some like low mid fluff in there and some like weight to the low end. And then the high noise layer, right, which I think does get it quite a bit closer to the original. Next we have a limiter, just compressing those three different sounds down. Then we have an OTT. Again, I have this band turned off, which I just felt like got a little bit less crispiness out of it. Then we have a little boost to this range and a bloom, and the bloom is I think important for this one, but if you don't have bloom, there's tons of like resonance suppression plugins now. Just get a resonance suppressor, and this one's just to add like that sheen and polish to the end of the sound. So hopefully from there you can, you know, have the comb and reverb filter tricks that you need to get something similar to this. Just note that like a lot of this is going to come from getting the right amount of distortion and also having like modulations on some of your wavetable frame positions here. I think there's a lot of ways to get a similar sound to this. Also remembering to add like things that are chordally pitched. So I have, you know, one note is playing the root of the tone and the other one is playing that octave and 7 semitones up. So then for our next one we have Two Hollis' song Lie, another kind of distorted saw bass but with some different techniques on this one.
Inspired, make my words come out in places they shouldn't be. Oh no, tie your shoe. I'm always torn apart. I'm easy target for you.
I'm going to move kind of to the next part here, which is this section of the sound, which is pretty vastly different, but using the same patch with some altercations.
Woo! Got me through, and what I do to be right with you, love true. Instead I chose the two. I chose the.
Okay, so how did I get this sound and why is it different and worthy of mentioning compared to the first Two Hollis sound that we have? And that is because I used a couple different voices for this one to get this sound. So our input that we have going into this is 3 different oscillators, a square wave that has no unison voices as the sub here, that is going through this dirty 24 filter where I'm plucking the, let me see, the resonance just stays high and then I'm plucking the frequency here. Using envelope 2, that's the settings for that one. And then we introduce a saw wave that's also pitched down an octave with 7 voices of unison, and then a saw wave that is at the original pitch or up an octave from the sub and the other layer. And that one has 5 voices of unison with a slimmer spread here, so less detuning, and mixing my sub back in. Then we had some linear fold distortion with a little pre-filter that is just, you know, distorting the highs after being pre-filtered. That's with full mix. That's with the mix turned down, and you need the mix turned down on this, or else the sub will lose the subbiness because it's also going through these effects. Then we send it through a multi-band compressor and OTT. So as you can kind of feel, that's brightening the sound up a good amount. That I can then pluck that brightness using an analog 24 filter, again with envelope 2 here. So then for post effects, I just want to note that the last thing in this chain really controls the volume of it. I don't want to have to change this knob a bunch, so I'm just going to start by showing there's a heavy compressor with a pretty short time at the end of this chain just to keep the volume in check so it's not slamming into my clipper, which is going to mess up what the processing sounds like on the video end. So we start with an OTT. And if I kind of turn the limiter off for a second, you'll see this is given some like rumbliness to the high end by this high band with the upwards compression, kind of bringing that piece in there. So I'll turn this depth back down. I'm gonna bring my compressor back on. Then we have a wave shaper where I'm using the fuzzy preset with the preamp turned up. Just adds fuzz, as the name would kind of lead you to believe. Then we have a low EQ here, and I'll lower the gain, the gain view mode on this. So you can see it's pretty relatively, a 6 decibel bump for the low mids, or for the mids, 6 decibel cut on the lows, and then a 3 decibel increase on the subs. And then we're dropping a good amount of the stereo width out of the low end. Then we have a fruity blood overdrive, super heavy preamp pushing, so like really heavy distortion on this piece. And we are sending that into a low pass with a little bump on the mids again. And then lastly for this one, we have a little Valhalla room, small, so I'm using the dark chorus ambience preset. Really small, just width added to it there. And so I do have some changes that happen right here, so I'll just kind of play this through so you can see how this EQ changes here. And basically what's going to be happening is this band is going to switch to a less steep band, and it's going to go up, but this high cut here is still going to be removing that like top amount out of it. Right, so just different ways to like allow in some of that distortion, which is something that I noticed was a little bit common in Two Hollis's, songwriting, I guess you would call it. So next we have the square bass that's pretty similar. It's just kind of the same oscillators that we have here. I'm gonna go through this relatively quick because I don't want to add 3 more patches to this. We basically have the same setup here. So we're sending a square wave pitch down an octave through a low pass that's just letting the sub through. Then we have a saw that's getting this analog 24 pluck on it. Then we have another saw that's up an octave, and again, it's kind of the same setup as the other one, so this is probably a cloned patch that I did, where I'm sending both of these into filter 2, and this nice long envelope 2 shape is kind of what's getting us our sound in this one. Then we have some distortion again. Then we have some compression. We have another filter, analog low 24 with key tracking on, drive all the way up. I might even turn the mix down a little bit on that. Yeah, I like it better with the mix down. I don't know if it's as similar to the original. Then we have a wave shaper. Kind of a wave folding type shape here. But as you can see here, I'm cutting most of the sub out of it. And then cutting those highs out as well, and then compressing it. Then the way that we get it to switch to this next, little piece of the sound is I've just added a one of these stab sounds that's going to be in Glitchy Bullshit Super 2 or whatever I end up naming that sample pack, that I'm sending through a couple post effects that I'll run through. So we just have a volume envelope here. Let me turn this off. And if you want to make one similar to this, it's just a synth pluck that I used a piano layer on the top end of. And I have set up a little volume envelope and then sent it into some chorus, followed by an EQ that's getting rid of even more of the sub, and then just compressing it down. And what that compressor is doing is just helping it be loud through the entire pluck. So you hear how it kind of starts and fades a lot quicker. In case you don't know about how, compression works, you're brand new to producing, just make sure you're adding makeup gain, because if you just compress it, it's just going to get quieter. You want to add that makeup gain. Right, this purple knob here is what adjusts the gain after you've compressed it. So that's going to be it for this sound. So moving from there into a string of a couple different 808 sounds that I think are worth breaking down. The first one's from Nobody's Fault Except My Own by Glaive.
Break the palisades, storm the palace gates. I'm alone again, I'm alone again.
And here's what it sounds like without the sidechain and other track elements going on. And so this one's made up of two different layers. First, we just have the sub layer here. And then we have this little like high, sparkly, sizzly piece. So I'll start by breaking down the sub for this one. And it is made, if you've made 808s, you probably can just skip this part. But like, I do think that this is a uniquely like textured 808 here. And so the reason I picked this 808 is because I think it has a really unique texture that comes from like a little bit of filtering and some of the stuff that we have going on for this one. So the basic piece of the sound here comes from, first of all, we have an envelope with a little bit of a, relatively high sustain, but not all the way at the top, 66% on that. And then we have this bend here that happens on the first shape, the first shape here is just a sine wave that I've added a bend to, where the second envelope has this short little hold at the beginning. So it holds at this position for a minute and then pops back down. So that's done by using this hold, this decay, and this is a really, really short envelope right here. You can't really tell because I've kind of shrunk it down. But all that happens before you even get to half a second. And then we have another piece here that's just a sine wave. And we have a pitch drop that's happening on both of these. So this third envelope here is the shortest yet. This is 30 milliseconds, this is 60 milliseconds. So it's a 0.051 second pitch drop that you can use the voice transpose in the global tab. Where is it at? Voice transpose. And it's pitched up 71. So dropping both of these super quick. I'm going to turn my sub off because we're going to just keep talking about this pitch bend, or this bend layer here that we have. Okay, and I'm doing something weird with the filters here. This is probably not that important, but basically I'm sending oscillator 1 to filter 1 and filter 2, and then so it's in parallel mode. It's going both to 1 and to 2. But I'm, at the same time, but I'm also sending filter 1 into filter 2, and notice how that does get a different tone from sending it into just filter 1 that then goes into 2. So this is from oscillator to filter 1 to filter 2. And then this is then this is from oscillator 1 to filter 1 and filter 2, and filter 1 is going into filter 2. So you get a little bit warmer sound from that. So what we have is a dirty 12 filter with a little bit of drive on filter 1, and then filter 2 we're just using again this envelope right here that's doing the bend with that little bit of hold. Just boosting our resonance right at this low mid section. So we mix that with our sub here, and we get that nice like warm plunky sound out of it. So then moving into our post effects here, we have a destructor with just pretty subtle, like if we turn both these all the way up, with a little bit of asymmetry on both of these, which is what adds that little bit of stereo. With the only distinction here being I also turned the mix down on these relatively far. So just, again, trying to warm up these low mid frequencies that I think are important to this type of a warm 808 sound. Then we have this overdrive with a lot of bias that I've turned the mix down on. So really warm, then we've lowered the warmth. So from really kind of almost like a heated, what are those called? Like overdrive tube amp type sound to more of a... So then I've added a little bit of a low end removal and a little boost to the, you know, around the 150, 160 range. Then this last piece is just the side chain. So how did we get the high end on this sound? Relatively easily. What I did to get this sound is just took the same patch, no adjustments, just changed it to saw waves and synth that into some frequency shifting. So here's the sound without any post effects. So just basically a shorter envelope. That's the only change here, is we've adjusted envelope 1 to be really short. And then I'm sending it into a frequency shifter using the ring mod with really high, you know, I got to change this to 20 kilohertz, and it's 14,561 hertz of ring mod adjustment. That's how you get to the ring mod on this. And then I've turned the stereo up on, I guess the stereo starts up. Yeah. And then I've added a bit crusher. So from this to giving it a little bit of crushness, you can't really hear it, I'm guessing, until you turn the compression up. I'm going to kind of speed through this. Then we have an abrasive with, you know, the threshold all the way down, so it just adds that fuzz to it. Right, that piece right there. And then we have an EQ. And then we have an Edison for the purpose of recording it. And why did I record it? And that is because if you don't record it, it doesn't change pitch with your notes here when you play it in MIDI. So if I just had these two layers playing without it being rendered to audio, so you'll see there in those notes that it doesn't actually change. Right, it keeps playing in that same position. I want it to play as if it's being repitched. So the way you can do that is rendering it to audio. Right, you just put it into its own mixer track. For this one, I didn't even like repitch it. I just set the note that it's playing, which is the note that I recorded it at, to be there. So changing this to here, which just kind of puts it in the original key of the sound. And then I'm probably running this into, yeah, just a low pass. So that's how I got this particular 808 sound. And it just ends up working really well with the tone of the original, this like creepy, you know, badly made synth sound. Thing of the original, kind of just an aesthetically unique Reese, or an aesthetically unique 808. So moving on to our next one here, we have nomu song Yvette. I don't know how to say it. Yvette. It's got to be Yvette or Yvette.
Stay by your side. You say you're good, but I still say you crying. You say it's fine, break out a smile, but I see through it. I see that you're dying inside every.
So this super blown out like heavy 808. Not gonna play it with the drums because it fits the best. And so how do we get this type of 808 sound? So we take a square wave and a saw wave, detune them slightly, and you'll notice that I have -34 and -22. That's just to match the pitch of the original song. You're gonna want to just set yours to like, you know, maybe like -5 and +7. You know, just give them a little bit of distance in between them. Then I have some ring modulation. Set your first envelope to be like this, and add it to the ring modulation from oscillator 1, from the saw wave to the square wave. Just gets us this like phasey saw square sound, and then I'm sending that through a dirty 12 filter with key tracking on and envelope 1, plucking the filter on that one. So the next thing that we have here is our post effects. Whoops. And our post effects for this one are going to start out with a wave shaper, again the TAHN style distortion. Then we follow that up with a low pass where the low mids are being boosted. And then we're going to follow that up with a destructor using Harmer Bit Crush, which is going to introduce some like crustiness to the high end. Right, with the mix turned down, it's a little more subtle. Then we add a limiter, compression. We're just compressing it down. And then lastly, we have an OTT where boosting the mids, kind of compressing the lows, and depths all the way up on this one, which I rarely do in the time at 100. I rarely do that too, but it worked. Just know you gotta cut out some of your gain that's being output. So I'm turning the output gain down. Now I'm sending this into a separate channel, and the reason for that is I'm gonna add that high end using the second channel here. So let me kind of like mute out this one. So we're just gonna be hearing the second channel now, our send, and we're getting this type of effect. In this case, I used a preset that I have that's called 808 Horse, H-O-A-R-S-E, so like horse, like your voice gets, and it's bit crushing, aperture, wave folding, and abrasive, which one at a time, you know, take that input, add some noise to it. Aperture adds like some heavy distortion, wave folding, more heavy distortion, and abrasive, noisiness. These are the 4 different modules that are at the bottom of this, and they're just like the most flavory, unique styles of distortion. There's some of the harmers are unique too, but these are the ones that I find get you like the crustiest, most digital, weird sounding distortion. So it's the 4 horsemen of Destructor put together. If you don't want to do, you know, a bunch of finicking in there, you can always just use a wave folder where I have, you know, the max drive, character, non-linearity or whatever being added to that. But I like the sound of the Destructor better, so then I'm just EQing it to kind of fit with my original sound and sending it through a wave shaper with tan distortion, but in a unipolar style. Right, so once I mix that with the original signal by just sending them both to the master bus, I do have my fruity send acting as a sidechain at the end. So without the sidechain, this is what this sounds like. You know, and it fits pretty well with
Stay on your side. You say you're good, but I still say
the track here. So that's gonna be it for this one. Let's move into another nomu song, Waste. So the next we have another nomu 808, and this one's more of like an organic feeling one, and you know, I've used a completely different method to get this one as well.
I don't wanna put it next to me. You only want me for attention, what's the rest of me? Yeah, you're feeling better off the ecstasy, and I can tell that you don't care, it's like you're testing me.
And so how is this one made? Why am I showing so many different 808s that are such a similar sound? Because this one's completely unique in another way. For this particular sound, I started with an acoustic bass from a sound font. Right, like rendered that to audio, and then I can do the rest of the sound design on this one just straight out of a sampler with some post effects. So first we're doing a volume envelope, and we're also going to add a little pitch drop that's really low amount and really slow. So without it, I'll kind of turn the octave up on this. And we're going to add our pitch drop in next, and you'll kind of hear it better with the octave being higher. So a slowly bending down, right? So that compared to this, flat, slow bending down, and then when we drop it, then for the post effects, we start with a limiter, kind of compressing that like initial thunk out of it. Then we have some tan distortion, some EQing, and the EQing is going to be important, and I would just really do this to fit with your mix. Don't just copy my EQ here, but I will say lowering the fundamental really tended to kind of get me a better, you know, lowering this frequency, you know, right here, and then raising our mids up helps it sound more like an, you know, it's less like a traditional 808, right? Like less like the classic Lex Luger 808 sound, and more like a you know, sampled acoustic, like if an 808 was an actual sound in a band or whatever, in a live production setup or like a studio setup. Then we're sending it through some wave shaping, basically just soft clipping it there and then compressing it again. Then lastly, before I forget to mention it, we also have on our sampler here, I've turned on mono and slide, and that just helps it bend between these two notes right here. So I'll mix it with the drums really quick because I just love how these 808s sound sidechain to these like heavy kicks. And that's going to be part of the sound design on this. If you're doing an 808 like this in your track, you're going to want to add a kick to some of the starts of these 808s here. So then moving into my next one, Two Hollis's little like hard style type 808 sound from Lie.
Up to my legs, point up looking like it don't last. Cause of my face, I'm handmade. 500 people looking for your face. 500 people talking on your name. 500 people sitting around my case. Push a few cake, no, ain't this it. Now I'm on your blade, now I'm on your blade.
And how is this particular type of sound done? This one has two layers. We have the top layer and the sub layer. Which uses like the traditional hardstyle kick development, which I'll kind of just go through right here. And so for this one, we use the traditional hardstyle technique of having a square wave or a saw wave. So in this case, a square wave, where we're just adding an envelope with a little bit of a hold, really short decay, and we're doing a pitch drop. In this case, instead of doing like the 36 semitone typical, 3 octaves up thing that we do sometimes, or 2 octaves up, we're gonna do 38, which will go up a minor second from the pitch that it ends up at, right? So we're kind of like almost doing a chord here, but just with that minor second from the root, which is the initial 0 pitch of this one, and then we're gonna send that into just an analog 12 filter where we're doing a bunch of drive key trackings on, and we're just trying to bring some of that high end out of it. Then I introduce some noise here, and I have a distortion that was on the whole time, but as you can see, it's just adding where the first piece of this hits some linear fold distortion to that first piece, and then we send it into a couple more things. So a distortion, bias turned all the way up. That's a nice, rubbery, type blown out 808 sound. Then we're just going to EQ this to let in a little bit of that high blip that's happening, but not a lot of it because we have another layer for that. And I've rendered it to audio, right? So I did that probably without the EQ on it, right? So no EQ, rendered that to audio. So that is the same as that, just normalized. And then I took this particular sound and I used it as another layer, right? So this is a good trick where you can render one of your sounds to audio, and I'm going to turn the effects off, and then use it as another layer for your sound. So I've just basically cut the length down here and then used the in out to like kind of fade the volume. And then I've added an envelope to this and a mod X filter. So what that is the envelope changes the gain of it, and the mod X filter sweeps this bandpass up and down real quick. So you can kind of see that this is like when it gets to its highest volume, it's just flicking this bandpass like that. And then I send it into some post effects, and I just try and kind of get the same tone as the original song. It's not that close, but it's relatively close. I have a wavefold distortion that I then EQ, that I then send into a Valhalla room. Really small reverb that I then send into a wave shaper. Some more EQing here. Just kind of boosting that mid frequency that I feel like is pretty prevalent in the original. Some more distortion, abrasive, which is one that I've mentioned before, and then Harmer Classic. There's not really a rhyme or reason there, just trying to get a similar tone. Then OTTing it, and then a little more compression. In this case, I'm actually using a limiter and just doing a brick wall limiter, which just stops the transients from being too pokey at certain parts of this. So then we mix that with the original signal, and just make sure we turn our EQ back on, which is relatively close to what the original sounds like. So then to finish this one out, we have Sands by blackwinterwells, this kind of plunky saw bass.
An inch in front of your face, can't even look me in the eyes, 'cause you're fucking ashamed. And like the sunrise, you're nowhere to be seen, because you're hiding
without the sidechain and other elements, it sounds like this. And so doing this one, this is the only one that I actually already patcherized. So I basically turned this into its own patcher rack to where you can get this sound really easily in a song and like adjust the main parameters that you need to adjust without having to know too much to actually like, you know, it just simplifies making this sound. And this is already on my Patreon. And I'll probably do this with the majority of these other sounds that I have here too. So this one starting out is LFO1 is on the level of a saw wave. That's pitched down 24 semitones and then half a semitone, but that's just in this particular like song remake. The patcher rack that I saved doesn't have this, but we're just sending a saw wave using LFO1 with trigger mode set up to kind of pluck at an 1/8 rate. 9 voices a unison. Then we have that going into filter 1, which is a dirty 12 high pass filter. Key tracking's turned on, and then this is just cutting out the sub from that saw wave there. Then we have a sine wave with this second LFO doing its level with like a more sustainy envelope than that first LFO that we have there. So kind of making the sub more present and more like full than our high end on this one. And that's being sent into a ladder 12 filter where I'm plucking this low band by LFO3. No, by LFO1. So it's plucking it at the LFO amp rate curve right there. So mixed together, we kind of get this like lush saw sound. And then we have some chorus that has, I guess that's only for a macro. So the chorus does nothing at this point. That's what, you know, I have these macros set up, which is what all these like surface knobs control. But in this case, I don't think that's actually doing anything. Filter, same thing. It's macroable so that we can kind of change that on the fly. OTT making it like very full and kind of synthetic sounding. And then I'm guessing we have, yeah, just a boosting, you know, low shelf and high shelf there. So then what is the rest of this patcher doing here? Basically, I've set up a stereo shaper. This isn't really not worth breaking down, but I've set up a stereo shaper to give me a mid-side EQ so that I can EQ the lows out of the sub while leaving them in the main piece of the sound, right? I want to just basically have an EQ where I can do a side cut off of the stereo of the low end, and you cannot do that in Pro Q3, but you can use a Fruity Stereo Shaper and do this frequency splitting, where I've basically taken this routes off just the side, so it sends the mid, you know, the mid signal to this next EQ and the side to this one, to where I can have this Fruity XYZ controller that basically has a remove sub stereo knob here, right? As I change this, it's removing the, you know, stereo from the sub. And then it mixes that signal back with this, which is another EQ that, again, I've kind of set up here to where I have a nice, easy low pass. Whoops, and I shouldn't be fucking with shit, but a low pass and high pass. The next thing you want to do if you're making the sound is just have a low pass filter that you bring in here. So kind of jumping off the patcher tangent back into the sound design. Then next I've just added this like compressor that, again, I've created like a compression auto knob basically here. And I didn't go too heavy on this particular one. And then lastly, I'm sending it through a destructor that doesn't do anything. But just for the fun, you know, showing patcher reasons. Basically, if you were making this sound, just send it in, you know, that's fully done. You don't need to add this last knob, but the last little effect, or this last little destructor here, the last one just turns it into an electric guitar by using some post effects. So I have this dirt knob that turns up these first 3. And you could EQ it again to kind of get like an actual guitar feel out of it. So and so that's gonna do it for this one. I think this is gonna be a particularly useful sound design video for anybody that wants to make Hyperpop 10 different basses that you know can use in Hyperpop. The 10th one, by the way, if you didn't see the short that links to this video, is Subi Club's song Laced Up. Just search that. It's a YouTube short. It's really quick. But I will say these videos are kind of a pain in the ass to make. It is not that fun to do. I like working on my music. I do not love working on other people's, you know, recreating their music, but people, you know, want to know how that's done. So if you want to help me out, you could go to Gumroad and buy some stuff. I have sample packs, Glitchy Bullshit Super. I'm going to do Glitchy Bullshit Super Duper and put that out at some point, or it might be out now. They're useful for this type of, genre, which is hyperpop or Dariacore, glitchcore, whatever the fuck you want to call it. I also have a Patreon where I do 100 samples every single month, plus one piece of bonus content. I've been slacking on the bonus content, so this month's bonus content is going to be this project file with a bunch of patcherized versions of these sounds coming out, in the next month or two. And then lastly, I do lessons over on Instagram. Just hit me up on there and I can, link up with you for lessons. It's like $25 for an hour right now. So with that being said, go stream my music, Rip Dance Club. Thank you for watching, and I will see y'all in the next one.